Hey everyone, I'm Ian Scott Cohen, your host and personal growth coach. Welcome to the Growth Coach podcast, where each episode I share actionable strategies and insights from positive psychology, self-improvement, and performance coaching to help you overcome setbacks, set ambitious goals, and really just think and feel like the best version of yourself. My goal with each episode is to leave you feeling energized and empowered so you can get back out there and live the life you've imagined for yourself. For more growth coaching tips and strategies, follow me on Instagram at Ian Scott Cohen or visit my website, ianscottcohen.com, for more info about my coaching programs. But for now, let's sit back and dive into this episode of The Growth Coach. Okay, hey everybody. Today we're going to talk about imposter syndrome, which honestly is both one of the most common things that I've seen in coaching. I've also experienced myself. I think a lot of us have. It comes up over and over again, maybe in different flavors. I see it a lot with founders, of course, but also in just professionals who are trying to work their way up or have worked their way up into a position, but for some reason have serious doubts about their own capabilities. And so it's extremely common, which is why I want to talk about it. But I will also say that it is extremely misunderstood, because I actually spent a couple of weeks going in and diving into a lot of the research papers that were actually written about imposter syndrome. And even the name imposter syndrome itself is not accurate. And so I wanted to do this mini series about imposter syndrome. It's going to be multiple parts. Today, what I'm going to do is just focus on what is imposter syndrome, what does it look like what does it feel like, what do you think, and why that happens, and then what does the research actually say. In the next part, I'll get into why imposter syndrome persists, but for this, I really just want to give us a foundation that we can build off of to dispel some of the myths and misnomers about imposter syndrome itself. So let's start with some definitions. And I wanted to go old school, so I just looked up the definitions in the Oxford Dictionary and Merriam-Webster just to give us like a baseline here that isn't totally biased. So I'm going to read the definitions to you so we can work from them and kind of break them apart into understanding what imposter syndrome is made up of, because it's really two major component parts. All right, so the Oxford Dictionary definition of imposter syndrome is as follows: the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. Now, it's a little long, so I'm going to read it again. This is the Oxford Dictionary definition of imposter syndrome. Quote, the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. All right, so the key to this definition is really it's our inability to believe in ourselves, believe that the success, the progress, the trappings, whatever we've been able to achieve, we are not able to believe that it was deserved and it was legitimately achieved. We feel like it was due to something else. Okay? Merriam-Webster's definition, it touches on something slightly different. So the Merriam-Webster definition is, quote, persistent doubt concerning one's abilities or accomplishments, accompanied by the fear of being exposed as a fraud despite evidence of one's ongoing success. So I'll read that one more time. Persistent doubt concerning one's abilities or accomplishments, accompanied by the fear of being exposed as a fraud despite evidence of one's ongoing success. Okay, so this one touches on the second aspect of imposter syndrome, which is this fear of being exposed as a fraud. The first definition was really about our own inability to believe in ourselves and that what we've achieved is deserved. The second definition hits on, we also have this fear that people are going to find out, right? They're going to find out that I'm actually incompetent, or I'm really dumb, or I do stupid stuff, or I make silly mistakes, despite evidence of one's ongoing success. That is such a critical component of imposter syndrome, because typically those of us who experience imposter syndrome are the ones who have already achieved something. Right? You're usually experiencing it from a position of achievement. And that is so critical because like in our Building Habits mini-series from before, so much of our thought processes and challenges are due to our beliefs, our underlying beliefs that we replay in our heads. And so in the second part of this, I'm going to go dive back into beliefs and how they come about and how to deconstruct them. But again, the imposter syndrome itself, definition is these two parts: an inability to believe in yourself and that what you've achieved is deserved, and a fear of being exposed as a fraud. So a fear of people figuring out that all of a sudden everything you ever did was illegitimate, was luck, or was somebody else, or whatever. Okay, so if that resonates with you, let's dive into what it actually might sound like in your head, and we'll see if this brings it home. So the first part, an inability to believe one's success is deserved or legitimately achieved. So to figure out if you're experiencing this, you might hear things like these types of thoughts in your head. So you might say to yourself, oh, if so-and-so hadn't helped me, I never would have gotten this job. Or if such and such hadn't helped me, I wouldn't have been able to actually buy this house or get into this school. You might say to yourself when you achieve something, oh, it's nothing. You minimize it. That's so common in today's culture, minimizing anything we achieve out of, a place of, we say we want to be humble, but it's also a way of diminishing our own self-confidence. Other things you might tell yourself, oh, they gave it to me. They gave me this job, or they gave me this award because I'm new, or because I'm a woman, or because I'm a person of color, or because I know the boss. Another thing you might tell yourself is, oh, when something good happens, I just got lucky this time. I just happened to get this opportunity. It was pure luck. I didn't really deserve it. And anyone could have done it, right? Yeah, that's a common reframe. It's like, yeah, anybody could have put this work in and done the same thing. It was not that challenging. And obviously baked into these things are a lot of assumptions and about what anybody is capable of. But these are the types of thoughts that plague a lot of us who experience imposter syndrome. You consistently tell yourself things that undermine your belief in yourself and what you've achieved as legitimate. The second piece, that fear piece, might sound like this. So again, the second piece of imposter syndrome is this fear of being exposed as a fraud, fear of people finding out that you're a lot dumber than you look, right? Or that, the work that you've done or the things you've accomplished were not due to any sort of genius, but actually because you're an average person who got lucky. So the fear might sound something like this. You might have these kinds of thoughts. You might think, oh, I'm not as competent as everybody thinks. I've just been really, really lucky so far. Or eventually people are going to realize, I don't belong here. I don't belong at this table. I don't belong in this role. I don't belong in this industry. Another thing you might tell yourself, if I make a mistake, it'll prove that I have no idea what I'm doing. Because you go through your day and you have a lot of uncertainty about decisions you make. And so you think, oh, once they see I make some stupid error, they're going to realize, wow, this person's really not capable. They're stupid and they don't deserve to be here. You might also tell yourself things like, everyone else seems so confident, but I'm just trying to keep up. That's one of the most isolating feelings sometimes is when you look around at a room full of people, whether your colleagues or your peers or people at a networking event or a conference, and you think you're seeing everybody's competent and confident, right? You look around and everybody's having great conversations. They're talking to people, and what you're telling yourself is that these people are all very, very capable. They're all operating at 100% confidence. When reality is almost everybody is operating at the same level of uncertainty. That's one of the tricks here is to realize that your insecurities or your self-doubt are typically not unique to you. So many people suffer from self-doubt. It's really just whether or not, or how you respond to it, which is what we're going to get to later in this mini-series. Another thing you might tell yourself, again, to kind of, as an example of having this fear of being exposed as a fraud or a fake, you might say, if they really knew how hard I have to work to even just get to where I am, they'd see that I'm unqualified. So these are the types of thoughts that might go through your head, and they certainly evoke feelings as well. And they have a huge impact. The imposter syndrome affects a lot of people. So in this next section, I'm going to go into the research, where actually this came from, who it impacts, and what do we actually know about it. And you're going to learn a lot in the next 10 minutes because it's stuff that nobody really talks about, but is really eye-opening. So in this next section, we're going to talk about the research behind imposter syndrome's impact and its origins. So let's talk about the impact of imposter syndrome. Who is this actually impacting? Spoiler alert, it's a lot of people. So here's one stat for you. KPMG did a study, or a survey, I should say, of high-performing executive women at one of their big conferences back in 2020. And 75% of these high-performing executive women, these are like C-suite, VPs, these are the top people in their companies, 75% of them agreed that they experienced feelings of being an imposter at some stage in their careers. Okay, so that's a huge number in executive women, one group. And as we're going to see in a second, this phenomenon, imposter syndrome, actually began with research amongst professional women. So I'll come back to that, but it definitely affects high-performing women in the workplace. Now, in the original, by the original researchers, they found that 70% of all adults, not just women, 70% of all adults have felt like an imposter at some point in their careers. So again, we're starting to see a theme here. Your professional life is where oftentimes you obviously have to produce things, you have to meet goals and standards and expectations, you strive to achieve new roles and responsibilities. And that stuff naturally comes with doubt. I mean, no one kind of barrels through everything with 100% confidence. It's not how it works, because nobody's been 100% successful all of the time. That's not how any success story has ever happened. So the fact that so many people experience this should be somewhat comforting, and also tell you that you might have a good dose of humility, which is actually healthy and will make you stronger and grow faster. Because obviously a lot of these folks have experienced it just like you, and are getting on and doing well. One more stat for you, and this one's actually particularly interesting. So this is from 2020, so a few years ago, but 50%, or half, of the peer-reviewed publications about imposter syndrome. So as of 2020, there were 62 peer-reviewed publications, and half of them, so 31 of them in 2020, had been published in just the last 7 years. Okay, so from 2013 to 2020, roughly, that's when half of all the research that's been done on imposter syndrome was published. Again, half of the papers. There are only 62 papers. I think today there's been many more. I couldn't tell you the total number. But the reason this is important is to tell you that this is still a very, very fresh and recent phenomenon that's being explored. We still are developing and sort of affirming our understanding of what this actually is. And as I'm going to show you in a second, imposter syndrome is so misunderstood by the average person, because sort of pop culture and has really taken bits of it and twisted it. So and it really even starts with calling it imposter syndrome itself. So I'm going to get back to that. But just know that this is something that we're still very much trying to understand, and the research has mostly been in the recent years. So the question is, why is that? Why all of a sudden in the 2010s did this become such a big deal that people had to really dive into? So I have some theories. Here are some things that really amplify those parts of imposter syndrome today. So the two parts were, an inability to believe in yourself, doubting your own abilities and your accomplishments, feeling like they're not legitimate, like you didn't deserve them. The second part of imposter syndrome is that fear of being exposed as a fraud, fear of people seeing you for the imperfect individual that you actually are, as opposed to the facade that you might put on at work or at home or wherever. And so why is this so amplified today? Why are more and more people experiencing it, forcing us to do more and more research on it? So there's a few reasons, I think. First is, today's world with technology, and again, 2010s, we saw the beginning of them as the advent of the smartphone plus social media. This came around like 2008, 2009. And so naturally, when all of that computing and mobile computing stuff really took off, we developed a huge new, maybe not new, but an enhanced or amplified culture of productivity, right? Like that's the rage today. Even my wife and I have been talking about it. It's like, we want to be productive today. We want to do things. And it's just this, especially in Western, like US culture, productivity seems to be like the measuring stick. Like, how productive were you today? What did you produce today? And so if productivity is one of the things you measure yourself by, you have to understand that you will always feel like you could have done more. There's no one who's productive or producing things every second of every day. It's just not physically possible, nor is it that important to do that. Most of what we produce isn't even that significant. But judging yourself on how much you produce, how productive you are, you can hopefully see how that relates to imposter syndrome. Because if you keep telling yourself, I'm not even being productive today, or I didn't get that much done, again, you're inserting self-doubt and self-limiting beliefs that all of a sudden there's this perfect person out there who's doing 20 times more than you are day in and day out. In reality, that's just not the case. I mean, almost all of us have sort of similar cadences, within the margins. All right, so that's one thing that's really amplifying it today. Another thing is wealth. So wealth today and wealth inequality today is obviously exacerbated, and there's enormous amounts of wealth out there. But what does it have to do with imposter syndrome? So my feeling here is that because wealth is so much on display now, and you actually could also include things like beauty and just idealized versions of the human experience, so to speak. Because we kind of see it everywhere, we're always feeling like we need more, right? Like, oh, I have a nice condo, but I need a house. Or I have a nice house, but I need a bigger house or a nicer car, or I need a better job, or I need this because this person has it or this person has it. So if you're surrounded by wealth and you see it everywhere, it's very, very easy to fall into the trap of believing that, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm not where I should be. If I wasn't an imposter, I would be, or I would have these types of things. So I think wealth exacerbates that because we also have a culture of wealth here at least in the U.S. And I think it propagates a lot of this stuff. Last two things I think amplify imposter syndrome today: mass information. So again, kind of related to the productivity, but because we're so interconnected now, everybody's on their devices almost all of the time. There's crazy stats out there that show that teens are on their phones like more than half the day, which is wild to me, but also totally believable if you've ever seen people walking around. Anyways, the point is, because we're so interconnected, we have access to information from all across the planet, which is not something that humans were evolved to process, right? Like as human beings, as a species, yes, we've evolved, but not that much to the point where, we're instinctually ready and able to process the vast amount of information we now have access to. But point being is, you see all this stuff out there. You have access to every piece of information in the world, and naturally that creates sort of an opposite effect, being like, oh, I'm so small, I'm so inadequate, look at all these people across the world doing all these different things, or I have access to everything I need, why am I not doing more, blah blah blah. And again, it's this sort of incorrect view of a single human like yourself versus where technology has taken us. Those two things are not going hand in hand. Technology and what we've been able to engineer is way outpacing our individual ability to process this stuff. The last thing, and maybe the most obvious one that kind of amplifies imposter syndrome, is social media, right? Social media, and I'm going to include LinkedIn in this, but also Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, whatever it is that you're on. A lot of them are built on this sort of comparison system where, people post versions of themselves, whether it's pictures or job updates or family updates. And a lot of people post very idealized versions of themselves. It's like, oh, you're out and it's rainy and you're having a miserable day, but you and your friend, like, oh, let's get a quick picture and smile. And all of a sudden that one single instance of you smiling in front of a camera makes it appear like you're having the best day ever. You're having the best life. But when other people see that, and you see that in your friends or your colleagues or whoever, that can really spark or trigger these feelings of imposter syndrome. It's like, wow, somebody out there is living their life better than I am. Why am I not living my life to the fullest in this exact moment right now? Which is, again, not a fair argument. It is your mind twisting itself to really just trigger your feelings of inadequacy, but it's not based off facts. So that's really where the impact of imposter syndrome comes from. You can see it affects a lot of professionals across the board, and now it's being amplified by culture and technology. And just to kind of put a bow on this part of the episode, feeling like an imposter, experiencing this, if you have this experience, it really is no way to live. Okay, this is something that if you're experiencing it, I highly recommend you take it on and try to challenge yourself to overcome it. You can overcome it. I do workshops on this. In the future parts of the series, we'll go into strategies, but I highly push you to try to overcome it, because feeling like an imposter hinders you in several ways. One, you can't internalize accomplishments. So even if you accomplish amazing things, if you let imposter syndrome sort of solidify itself in your mind, then it becomes very, very hard for you to actually feel pride and enjoy yourself and what you've achieved. You miss growth opportunities. So if new roles come up or new events come out, you start to have doubt in yourself and not actually want to go out and pursue these new things because they're challenges and they're risky, and you feel like they're actually opportunities to be exposed as lesser than you are. You avoid the risk of new experiences, same idea. And ultimately, you live in kind of this fearful mode, right? You walk around with a sense of anxiety about interacting with other people, or not presenting your best self at work, and that is really, really negative, and it can lead people to dark places. But it's just not a positive way to live, and so that's why this subject is so important to me, and I think why it's so common. We really have to tackle it head on. Okay, so in this last section of this episode, I'm going to talk about what that research actually says. So takeaways so far: imposter syndrome is when we doubt our own ability and achievements while fearing being exposed as a fraud. And imposter syndrome is extremely common, and is amplified by culture and technology. All right, so in this last section, we're going to dive into the research. So let's get to that. All right, what does the research actually say about imposter syndrome? Where does it even come from, actually? All right, so imposter syndrome, the concept, actually was first described by two researchers, Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes, two women, in 1978. And here's where the story really takes a different direction. Imposter syndrome is not what it was called. Clance and Imes described this imposter phenomenon. That's what they called it in their paper. And they were studying it among high-achieving women, as we've seen in the last section, still very prevalent among high-achieving women. And so when they discovered this, or sort of pieced it together, they termed it the imposter phenomenon, not imposter syndrome. Now, why is that important? Well, the words we use are super important, because obviously they convey meaning, and the meaning tells us how seriously or not we should take it, how we should think about something. I'm not exactly sure when syndrome became part of the terminology here, but another research group went about this and put it in a very succinct and effective way. So I'm actually quote a different research paper that discusses why calling it imposter syndrome is not a good thing and not accurate. Instead of imposter phenomenon, like the original researchers Clance and Imes did back in 1978. So this is a quote from another research paper, and I'll include all these links in the show notes. So these researchers said, quote, "Depicting the phenomenon as a syndrome gives the impression that the individuals who experience it are patients, which is highly problematic, as it implies a medical model of dysfunction within the individual." All right, so I'm going to say that one more time. But again, they're talking about why it's so important to not call this a syndrome and instead use the original term phenomenon. So they say, quote, "Depicting the phenomenon as a syndrome gives the impression that the individuals who experience it are patients, which is highly problematic, as it implies a medical model of dysfunction within the individual." All right, so basically what they're saying is, when you say the word syndrome, it makes us think that this is a medical problem and that it is inherent to you as the individual. It's something wrong with you. And as they point out, and a lot of research points out, that is actually not the case at all. So instead of thinking this as a syndrome, we need to think of it as its original description, which is a phenomenon, just something that we see prevalent amongst a group of people in this case, not necessarily something that's medically inherent to you and your psyche, because that makes you think that you need treatment, that you're a patient. And that is not the case. This is not actually, imposter syndrome is not in the DSM, which is sort of like the Bible for psychology. It is not an official designation that they use. And so we might think it is because it's used so much in pop culture and the workplace, but it's not. It is not a medical problem. You do not have any sort of psychological problem that can be cured with medication, right? So instead, and I really love how they describe this, these researchers said it's not a syndrome. They say to describe it, it is a state, not a trait. Okay, so imposter phenomenon is a state, not a trait. It's a state of mind. It's a state of where you are in this moment. It is not a trait inherent to you. Okay, so that means that sometimes, and this probably resonates, right? Sometimes you feel super confident. Sometimes you do things and you feel great. You go home at the end of the day, you feel like you did a lot. And so there are other times like, oh shoot, I don't belong. I didn't achieve this thing because I deserved it. That is a great illustration of how this is actually just a state of mind that we can enter in and out of, as opposed to a trait that we have as part of ourselves. All right, so it is a state and not a trait. And so if it's a state and not a trait, where does it come from? Like what is actually causing this imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon? So researchers now, a lot of them argue that imposter phenomenon arises from dysfunctional context, not a dysfunctional person. So it comes from a dysfunctional context. So the context that you're in, and I'll give you a few examples, that is where this stuff gets triggered and arises from. So one context that is oftentimes where it starts is at school. Growing up, school and the system that we have is very, very much based off of two things. Comparison, right? We all get letter grades and numerical grades, and you can't help as children but see each other's grades, compare them, and that comparison immediately makes you feel like you are below some people or above some other people, and so it sort of seeds this comparative nature inside of our psyches that later on becomes where a lot of this imposter syndrome springs out of, because now you're used to and you feel like you're supposed to be comparing your accomplishments and achievements to everybody around you, which obviously is not the case. And school does not have to be structured that way, but in the US at least, and many other places, it is structured that way. The other thing that happens in school that contributes to the dysfunctional context where imposter phenomenon arises out of is minimization. So I referenced this earlier, but when you minimize something, your accomplishments mainly, it's you take the power away from them and you make it seem like they are less than they are. So if you just landed a big deal or a big sale, you might say, oh, it wasn't that big and we still need to land 9 others or whatever. Minimizing accomplishments, you tell yourself it's out of being humble, but in reality it's out of a lack of belief in yourself. And so at school, again, like that can happen a lot with grades and other things. So if you get, a 70% on something, you get a C, I think that is. And obviously a C in school is not great. We say it's, average or whatever. But if you got a 70 out of 100, that's pretty good so far, right? In baseball, the best hitters hit 300, hit 30% of the pitches for actual hits, right? A great hitter hitting 30% of something is wild. So the context here matters, and the context in this case is also what triggers some of this imposter syndrome stuff. The next place that this can happen, this next context that you can find yourself in that might be dysfunctional, is at work, of course. So at work, this is especially true for women and people of color. Underrepresentation is a huge deal, right? So if you're a black woman sitting at a table with only white men, yeah, it's going to be very, very difficult to initially feel like you belong there because you don't see other people there who look like you. And that does matter. For a lot of us who grew up as the majority in our communities, it's hard to really understand what that can feel like. But it certainly can be triggered even if you're a white person. If you're in a predominantly community of color and you find yourself in a room full of people of color, you can experience a taste of what it can be like. Obviously, nowhere close to the experience that people of color have or women have, but that certainly contributes. So underrepresentation is a big trigger at work. Also, low emotional intelligence, low EQ. So managers are oftentimes folks who, inadvertently trigger imposters' feelings. So for instance, if you have a manager who only likes to call on or take ideas from a couple of people on the team, but they never call on you, they never ask for your ideas, and they clearly don't seem to believe in your creativity. Those types of things, one person's inability to be self-aware and be a good manager might make you think that you are not worthy, that you are not good enough, that you are in fact an imposter. But in reality, that's their problem. That's them being bad at their jobs. It doesn't help you necessarily in the moment, but it's important to know where this comes from. It's the context. It is not you. Again, this is a state, not a trait. And the last one I'd like to highlight is family and culture. So we kind of talked about culture earlier with the whole amplification around technology and social media. But I will say family definitely is a place where imposter syndrome can be sown and start to arise from. Conflicting expectations. So if your parents expect you to be a doctor, but you really want to be an artist, that can really set the foundation for imposter feelings. Or if they want you to, you get the idea. Or if you're comparing yourself to your siblings, one sibling is super successful in one field, but you're not as quote unquote successful in your field yet, you can use that to sort of spin yourself into a dizzying imposter syndrome state of mind. And then moving the goalposts, right? Like if, you graduated college, you're feeling great, but then it's like, hey, when are you going to get a boyfriend? Or when are you going to get married? When are you going to have children? When are you going to buy a house? So the goalposts seem to keep moving, especially in families that can kind of snipe at each other, or families that are trying to push you to achieve, but don't realize that it's actually also undermining your confidence and your ability to enjoy what you do. So again, this imposter phenomenon is a state. It is not a trait. It is not inherent to you. It oftentimes arises from dysfunctional context that you find yourself in, whether it's at school or at work or amongst your family and culture. And then things that can trigger these imposter feelings, things like failure. Obviously, even small setbacks can set off your imposter thoughts. Comparing yourself to others, even getting praise. Recognition often leads to minimization. So getting praise sometimes can trigger these feelings. And then rumination, right? So who better to bring us down than ourselves? So you might take a bad experience or a bad call or a mistake you made, and we have all made them, and just keep working through that memory over and over. And what you're doing is you're actually solidifying it. You're really strengthening the synapses that'll make it come up even more often. So every time you give a thought time, you're actually giving it more strength and power. And so rumination is definitely a gateway to, or on-ramp, I should say, to imposter feelings. All right, so that's where I'm going to leave this first part of this series. So key takeaways here. Imposter phenomenon is not a syndrome, right? You are not a patient. It's a state, not a trait. And imposter feelings arise due to dysfunctional context, not you as the individual. And so I'll leave you with this sort of, task or charge. Over the next week or so, or even just the next 48 hours, start to pay more attention to your context. If you have imposter syndrome feelings or imposter phenomenon feelings a lot, or you feel like your success isn't deserved, you're doubting your own abilities, start to just go back to being observing self. Look around at your context. See how people interact with you. See what they do. See how the places that you're putting yourself in, how they might trigger some of these feelings or contribute to some of these beliefs, as a way to start building some awareness. And then in the next episode of this mini-series on imposter syndrome, we're going to dive into why this stuff persists. So what are these underlying obstacles that make imposter syndrome so hard to overcome? And then we'll get into some strategies to actually how to develop a growth mentality which is sort of the approach I take with folks I work with, and how to use continuous self-improvement and resilience to really get to a place of not only fulfillment, but also self-assuredness. All right, so this has been, first part of what's going to be a multi-part mini-series about imposter syndrome, and hopefully this was useful information to get you started, but just know that it's a very common thing if you're experiencing it. It is a state of mind. It is not a trait, so you can definitely get past it and stay away from that state of mind, and in the future episodes, I'll help you do that, but hopefully it's been informative and can help you think more deeply about the context you find yourself in, and we'll see you next time. Hey friends, before you go, I want to tell you about one more free coaching resource called The Gas Up. It is my weekly coaching email I send out every Sunday evening to help you get engaged and ready for the week ahead. You can sign up now using the link in the show notes, or follow me on Instagram at Ian Scott Cohen to find the link in my bio. And if you forget, you can always find all this information and more about my coaching programs at www.ianscottcohen.com. Thanks again for tuning in to the Growth Coach podcast, and we'll see you next time.